Struggling Cowboy buried his friend. Until he found him sitting at the bar, he dug his best friend's grave with hands that still shook from pulling the trigger, and 3 years of friendship died with every shovel of dirt that hit the pine box. The sun hung like a copper coin against the bleached sky, offering no mercy to the man who knelt in the dust beside a body wrapped in faded wool. Ezra Colt's hands trembled as he pulled the rough blanket higher, covering the face he'd known better than his own reflection. Tommy Brennan lay still as carved stone, his crooked grin silenced forever, that scar running from ear to jaw, now just another mark on skin that would never warm again. 3 years. 3 years of riding side by side, through cattle drives and card games, through hungry nights and flush times, through storms that tried to wash them clean and sun that baked the sin right into their bones. 3 years of watching each other's backs, sharing the last beans from a dented can, arguing over who got the softer ground to sleep on. All of it ending in 30 seconds of gunfire over a woman's honor and a stranger's insult. Ezra's shovel bit into the hard earth with the sound of metal against stone. The ground here was stubborn, baked solid by months without rain, fighting him with every scoop. His shoulders burned, his palms blistered and bled, but he kept digging. This was the least he could do. The very least. Should have been me, he whispered to the wind that carried nothing but dust and the distant cry of a hawk. Should have been me lying there. But it wasn't. Tommy had stepped forward when that drunk cowboy started talking ugly about the saloon girl. Tommy had put his hand on his gun when the man called her something no woman deserved to hear. And Tommy had drawn first when the stranger's eyes went cold and dangerous. Only Tommy had been half a second too slow. The hole grew deeper, one shovelful at a time. Ezra's shirt stuck to his back with sweat and grief, his hat brim dripping salt onto the thirsty ground. Above him, vultures circled in lazy spirals, patient as death itself. They knew what he knew, that nothing good lasted long out here in this broken country where water was scarce and mercy scarcer still. He remembered Tommy's laugh, how it started low in his chest and built until it filled whatever space they were in. Remembered how Tommy always saved the last bite of jerky for him when their supplies ran thin. How Tommy sang old songs around the campfire, voice rough as sandpaper but true as gospel. How Tommy never asked questions when Ezra woke up screaming from dreams he couldn't name. "We were going to buy that spread outside Tucson," Ezra said to the body that couldn't hear him anymore. "Remember? You said we'd raise horses. Said you were tired of other people's cattle and other people's troubles." His voice cracked like dry wood. "Said we'd find us some good women and settle down proper." The shovel struck something hard, a root, maybe, or stone. Ezra dropped to his knees and clawed at the earth with his bare hands, fingernails splitting, knuckles scraping raw against the unforgiving dirt. Blood mixed with soil, and still he dug. By the time he lowered Tommy into the ground, the sun had moved halfway across the sky. The body felt heavier than it should have, as if death had added weight instead of taking it away. Ezra's hands shook as he arranged Tommy's arms across his chest, the way his mama used to do for the sick chickens when he was small. "I'm sorry," he whispered, and meant it deeper than any words he'd ever spoken. "I'm sorry I didn't draw faster. Sorry I didn't see it coming. Sorry I let you step up when it should have been me." The first shovelful of dirt hit the blanket with a sound like rain on canvas. The second fell quieter. By the 10th, Ezra couldn't see Tommy's face anymore, and by the 100th, there was nothing left but a mound of earth that looked like every other grave in every other forgotten corner of this territory. He stood there as the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky the color of old blood. His shadow stretched long across the fresh-turned dirt, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate, lonely and wild and lost. Ezra picked up his hat, dusted it off, and placed it back on his head. His horse, a tired sorrel mare named Patience, stood hip-shot near a clump of mesquite, waiting with the kind of animal wisdom that knew grief had its own time and couldn't be hurried. "Come on, girl," he said, his voice barely more than whined through dead leaves. "Nothing left for us here." But as he swung up into the saddle and turned Patience toward the darkening road, Ezra couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't finished. Something about the way Tommy had fallen, or the stranger's too quick smile, or the silence that had followed the gunshots like a held breath. The wind picked up, scattering dust across the grave and into the gathering dark, carrying whispers that sounded almost like his dead friend's voice calling his name. Some burdens followed a man no matter how far he rode, and some graves weren't deep enough to hold the truth. 2 weeks after burying his best friend, Ezra walked into a saloon and saw the impossible. Tommy Brennan, alive as sunrise, raising a glass of whiskey and laughing like death was just another stranger's joke. 2 weeks of hard riding had worn Ezra down to bone and gristle. The road from Tommy's grave to Redemption Creek stretched like a scar across broken country, winding through canyons that echoed with wind and emptiness. His horse Patience limped on her left front leg, favoring it more each mile, and his coin purse held barely enough silver to buy grain, let alone a room with a real bed. Redemption Creek squatted in a valley between red mesas like something that had crawled there to die. The buildings leaned against each other for support, their paint long since scoured away by sand and sun. A few tired horses stood hitched to rails, their heads hanging low, and somewhere a dog barked once and gave up. Ezra's stomach cramped with hunger. He hadn't eaten since yesterday's breakfast of stale hardtack and creek water that tasted of alkali. The saloon ahead promised warmth, maybe some beans and bread, and whiskey strong enough to quiet the voices that followed him from Tommy's grave. The batwing doors swung open with a sound like broken wings. Inside, smoke hung thick as morning fog, and the air tasted of unwashed bodies, spilled liquor, and dreams gone sour. A piano in the corner wheezed out a tune that might have been cheerful once, and a few cowboys hunched over cards at scarred tables. Ezra made it 3 steps inside before the world tilted sideways and his heart forgot how to beat. There, clear as daylight and twice as real, sat Tommy Brennan at the far end of the bar. Same crooked grin that had charmed saloon girls from here to El Paso. Same shock of dark hair that never stayed where it was supposed to. Same scar running from his left ear to the corner of his jaw, white as bone against sun-weathered skin. He wore a different shirt, clean blue cotton instead of the faded red wool Ezra had wrapped him in, but everything else was exactly, impossibly the same. Tommy lifted a glass of amber whiskey, said something to the bartender that made the man laugh, and drained it in one smooth motion. He set the glass down with a satisfied sigh and called for another. Ezra's hand found his gun without thinking, fingers wrapping around the grip like it was the only solid thing left in a world gone mad. His breath came shallow and quick, and cold sweat beaded on his forehead despite the saloon's warmth. Dead men didn't drink whiskey. Dead men didn't laugh at bartenders' jokes. Dead men stayed buried in the ground where you left them, wrapped in wool blankets and covered with 6 feet of stubborn earth. But there Tommy sat, solid as sin and twice as real as anything else in that smoke-filled room. "Impossible," Ezra whispered, and the word tasted like grave dirt. Tommy must have heard something, maybe the whisper, maybe the sound of leather creaking as Ezra's hand tightened on his gun, because he turned on his bar stool and looked straight at him. Their eyes met across 30 feet of smoky air, and for a heartbeat, neither man moved. Then Tommy's face split into that familiar grin, the one that had gotten them both into more trouble than they could count. He raised his fresh glass in a mock salute and called out, "Well, I'll be damned. Ezra Colt, as I live and breathe. Live and breathe." The words hit Ezra like physical blows. He stumbled backward, bumping into a table where 2 cowboys were playing poker. Cards scattered, and one of the men cursed, but Ezra barely heard him. The room spun like a child's top, and his mouth tasted of copper and fear. "You're dead," he said, loud enough for half the saloon to hear. Conversation stopped. The piano player's hands paused on the keys. "I buried you myself. I dug your grave and put you in the ground." Tommy's grin faltered, replaced by something that might have been confusion or concern. He slid off his bar stool and took a step forward, hands raised like he was approaching a spooked horse. "Easy there, friend," he said, and his voice was Tommy's voice, rough and warm and real as rain. I don't know what grave you're talking about, but I'm standing right here. Name's Jacob Brennan, and I've been looking for someone who might know my brother Tommy. Jacob. The name hung in the air like gun smoke. Ezra stared at the man who wore Tommy's face, searching for some sign that this was all a fever dream brought on by grief and too many sleepless nights. But Jacob Brennan stood solid and breathing in the lamplight, casting a shadow that dead men shouldn't have. Your brother, Ezra repeated, and his voice sounded strange in his own ears. Twin brother, Jacob said, taking another careful step. Separated when we were babies. I've been tracking him for years, following stories and rumors across half the territory. Last I heard, he was riding with a man named Ezra Colt. The saloon had gone quiet as a church. Even the piano player had stopped pretending to play, his hands frozen above the keys. Ezra felt every eye in the room on him, weighing his words, judging his reaction. Twin brother. It was possible, he supposed. Tommy had never talked much about family, never mentioned where he came from before they'd met in that cattle camp 3 years ago. Said he was an orphan, raised by strangers, but maybe there had been more to the story. Tommy's dead, Ezra said, holstering his gun with shaking hands. Shot down 2 weeks ago in a saloon fight. I buried him in the desert. Something flickered in Jacob's eyes, grief, maybe, or something deeper and harder to name. He nodded slowly and finished his whiskey in one burning swallow. Then I'm too late, he said, and the words carried the weight of years of searching, of hope finally dying. Story of my life, I suppose. But even as Jacob spoke of loss and lateness, Ezra caught something in his expression, a flicker of recognition, a shadow of shared memory that shouldn't have existed between strangers. Twins separated at birth wouldn't know each other's secrets, wouldn't carry the same scars of friendship and betrayal. The truth sat between them like a loaded gun, and Ezra wasn't sure if he had the courage to pull the trigger. In the yellow lamplight of a frontier saloon, some questions were more dangerous than bullets, and some truths had teeth sharp enough to tear a man's world apart. Jacob Brennan knew things about Tommy that only a best friend should know, and when he smiled, Ezra saw ghosts dancing behind his eyes, whispering secrets that separated twins could never share. They sat outside the saloon on a weathered bench that had seen better decades, sharing a bottle of whiskey that burned like liquid truth. The night air carried the scent of sage and distant rain, and somewhere in the darkness, an owl called to its mate with a voice like mourning. Jacob Brennan spoke in Tommy's cadence, with Tommy's gestures, his hands moving through the air like he was painting pictures only he could see. He told stories of growing up with strangers who fed him but never loved him, of working ranches from the time he could hold a rope, of always feeling like half of something was missing. Funny thing about being a twin, Jacob said, tilting the bottle toward the star-scattered sky. Even when you don't know you are one, you feel the empty space. Like walking around with one boot off, or trying to clap with one hand. Ezra watched him drink, and tried to ignore how Jacob's throat worked exactly like Tommy's had, how he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand in that same quick motion. Every gesture was a knife twist, every familiar movement a reminder of what he'd lost. Tell me about him, Jacob said, passing the bottle. Tell me about my brother. So Ezra did. He talked about Tommy's laugh and how it could fill up the emptiness between mountains. About how Tommy always saved the last bite of food for whoever looked hungriest. About the way he sang old songs around campfires, voice rough as sandpaper but true as any gospel. About how he never asked questions when Ezra woke up screaming from dreams he couldn't name. Jacob listened like a man dying of thirst listens to the sound of rain. His eyes never left Ezra's face, drinking in every word, every memory, storing them away like precious stones. He had this way of reading people, Ezra said, the whiskey loosening his tongue and softening the edges of his grief. Could look at a man and know if he was honest or crooked, brave or yellow. Saved us from trouble more times than I can count. Like that time in Abilene, Jacob said quietly, when the card sharp tried to run a cold deck, and Tommy knew before the man even sat down. The words hit Ezra like a physical blow. He set the bottle down with shaking hands and stared at Jacob, whose face had gone pale in the moonlight. "I never told you about Abilene," Ezra said, his voice barely more than wind through grass. Jacob's eyes widened, and for a moment, something flickered behind them. Panic, maybe, or the look of a man who'd just stepped off a cliff. "Must have been," he stammered. "Must have been someone else told me." Another cowboy who knew Tommy. But Ezra was remembering now, really remembering. The card sharp in Abilene had been their secret, something they'd never told another soul. Tommy had spotted the marked deck before the dealer even shuffled, had whispered a warning that saved them both from losing their month's wages to a cheat. Nobody else knew about that, Ezra said, standing up so fast the bench rocked. "Tommy made me swear never to tell. Said it was bad luck to brag about spotting a cheat." Jacob stood too, his hands raised like he was gentling a spooked horse. "Now hold on, Ezra. Maybe Tommy told someone else. Maybe. And what about the scar on your jaw?" Ezra's voice was gaining strength, gaining anger. "You want to tell me how you got a scar in the exact same place as your twin brother, from an accident you never shared?" The lie crumbled in Jacob's face like a house of cards in a strong wind. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. In the moonlight, he looked exactly like Tommy had that time they'd been caught stealing apple from Old Man Henderson's orchard, guilty and defiant and sorry all at once. "The scar," Jacob said finally, his voice small as a whisper, "came from a broken bottle in a Dodge City saloon fight. 3 years ago, right before I met you." The truth hit Ezra like a kick from an angry mule. Not Jacob, not a twin brother separated at birth. Just Tommy, alive and breathing and lying through his teeth about being dead. "You son of a bitch," Ezra whispered, and the words carried all his grief and rage and desperate hope. "You let me bury a stranger. You let me think you were dead." Tommy, because it was Tommy, had always been Tommy, took a step back, his hands still raised. "It wasn't supposed to happen that way. The man who got shot, he'd been using my name, my reputation. When you showed up at the Undertaker's, they thought you meant him. And you just let me believe it." Ezra's hand found his gun again, not to draw it, but to anchor himself to something solid in a world that kept shifting under his feet. "You watched me grieve. You let me dig a grave for nothing. I thought it was better," Tommy said, and his voice cracked like dry wood. "I thought if you believed I was dead, you'd move on. Find something better than following a broken-down cowboy with more enemies than sense. That wasn't your choice to make." The words came out harsh as winter wind. "You had no right to decide what was better for me." Tommy's shoulders sagged like he was carrying the weight of all his lies, all his good intentions gone wrong. "I know," he said. "God help me, I know." In the distance, a coyote howled, and another answered from across the valley. The sound was lonely and wild and full of grief, like the song of every lost soul wandering the desert in search of something they'd never find. Ezra stared at his friend, his alive, breathing, lying friend, and felt something crack open in his chest. Not his heart breaking again, but something else. Something that might have been forgiveness or fury or relief so strong it felt like drowning. "Why?" he asked. And the word held 3 years of friendship and 2 weeks of mourning and a lifetime of questions he'd never thought to ask. Tommy looked up at the stars, as if the answer might be written there in light and darkness. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of every mistake he'd ever made and every truth he'd tried to bury. Some confessions were harder to hear than the lies that came before them, and some friendships had to die before they could be reborn. Under a blanket of desert stars, Tommy Brennan finally told the truth about why he let his best friend believe he was dead, and some confessions cut deeper than any grave. The stars wheeled overhead like scattered coins on black velvet, and Tommy Brennan finally found the courage to tell the truth that had been eating him alive for 2 weeks. "The man who died," he said, his voice barely louder than the desert wind. "His name was William Cross. He'd been using my name, my reputation, for months. Winning card games on my skill, charming women with stories of things I'd done. When that drunk cowboy started trouble about the saloon girl, Cross stepped up because he thought he was Tommy Brennan, and Tommy Brennan never backed down from a fight. Ezra sat silent as stone, the whiskey bottle forgotten at his feet. The anger in his chest had burned down to something colder and deeper, not rage, but a kind of hollow ache that felt like grief wearing a different coat. Cross was faster than me, Tommy continued, staring at his hands like they held answers he'd been searching for. Better shot, better with cards, better at everything except staying alive when it mattered. He drew first, fired clean, but that drunk cowboy got lucky. 1 in 1,000 chance, and it took Cross right through the heart. The night air carried the scent of sage and something that might have been rain, though no clouds marked the star-bright sky. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called once and went quiet, as if even the wild things understood the weight of confession. I was upstairs when it happened, Tommy said. Heard the shots, came running, found Cross bleeding out on the sawdust. He looked up at me with these eyes, Ezra, like he was seeing his own face in mine. Last thing he said was, "Tell them Tommy Brennan died honest." Then he was gone. Ezra's throat felt raw as rope burn. So you let him keep your name, even in death. Seemed right somehow. He'd been living as Tommy Brennan. Let him die as Tommy Brennan too. Tommy's voice cracked like dry wood. When you showed up at the Undertaker's, asking about your partner, they pointed you to Cross. I was standing right there in the crowd, watching you grieve for a stranger wearing my name. The words hit Ezra like physical blows. He remembered that day, the weight of the pine coffin, the way his hands had shaken as he'd hammered the nails. All of it for a man he'd never met, while his real friend watched from the shadows like a ghost made flesh. I could have spoken up, Tommy said. Should have. But I saw something in your face, Ezra. Something I'd never seen before. What? The word came out harsher than Ezra intended. Peace. Tommy looked up at the stars, and tears tracked silver down his weathered cheeks. For the first time since I'd known you, you looked at peace. Like some burden you'd been carrying was finally lifted. And I thought maybe Tommy Brennan dying was the best thing that could happen to you. Ezra wanted to hit him. Wanted to grab Tommy by the shoulders and shake him until his teeth rattled. Instead, he picked up the whiskey bottle and took a long pull that burned all the way down. You had no right, he said finally. No right to decide what was best for me. I know. The words were small as whispered prayers. God help me, I know. They sat in silence for a long time, listening to the desert breathe around them. Wind moved through the mesquite with a sound like old women grieving, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate with a voice that held all the loneliness in the world. Why come clean now? Ezra asked. Why not let sleeping dogs lie? Tommy was quiet, so long that Ezra thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of every mile he'd ridden, every regret he'd swallowed like bitter medicine. Because I've been watching you, Ezra. Following you for 2 weeks, staying just far enough back to keep out of sight. And I saw what my death did to you. Saw how you stopped singing around your campfire. Saw how you'd wake up screaming my name. Saw you talking to my grave like I was still there to hear you. Ezra's chest tightened. All those nights he'd thought he was alone with his grief, Tommy had been out there in the darkness, watching him break apart piece by piece. Dead men don't feel guilt, Tommy said. But I do. Every day, every night, eating at me like alkali water. William Cross died honest like he wanted, but I've been living as a lie, and lies have weight, Ezra. They follow you like shadows, growing longer with every step. The truth of it settled between them like dust after a windstorm. Ezra thought about the stranger he'd buried, about the grave he'd dug with his own bleeding hands, about the tears he'd shed for a man he'd never known. It should have made him angrier, but somehow it didn't. Instead, he felt something he hadn't expected, understanding. What now? He asked. Tommy met his eyes for the first time since the confession began. Now I ask for something I got no right to ask for. I ask you to forgive a fool who thought he could spare you pain by carrying it himself. Forgiveness. The word hung in the air like smoke from a dying campfire. Ezra turned it over in his mind, feeling its weight and shape. It wasn't what he'd expected to be carrying when he'd ridden into Redemption Creek. But then again, nothing about the last 2 weeks had gone as expected. The man I buried, Ezra said slowly, cross. He wasn't just using your name, was he? He was trying to be you. Try to live up to something he'd heard about Tommy Brennan. Reckon so. Then maybe, Ezra said, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. Maybe he earned the right to keep it. Maybe Tommy Brennan did die that day. And what's sitting next to me is someone else. Someone who's got to figure out who he wants to be. Understanding flickered in Tommy's eyes like the first light of dawn. And you, Ezra? Who do you want to be? Ezra looked up at the stars, those ancient lights that had watched over countless frontier graves and desert confessions. I want to be the kind of man who doesn't ride alone, he said. The kind who doesn't let his friends carry their burdens in silence. Tommy's smile was different from the old crooked grin. Smaller, sadder, but somehow more real. That spread outside Tucson still for sale, you think? Reckon we could find out. The wind picked up, scattering dust and the ghosts of old hurts across the desert floor. In the distance, two coyotes sang to each other across the darkness, their voices twining together in a song as old as the territory itself. It was a song of loss and finding, of death and resurrection, of friendship that survived even the grave. Some truths were too heavy for one man to carry alone, Ezra thought as he watched his friend, his living, breathing, complicated friend, tip his hat back and look up at the infinite sky. And some forgiveness came not in grand gestures, but in the simple decision to keep riding forward together into whatever dawn was waiting just beyond the horizon. The dead could keep their secrets. The living had work to do. Under the desert stars, two men who had lost each other found something better than what they'd had before. The courage to build a friendship on truth instead of legend, on forgiveness instead of regret.